We are going to be finishing up some of our talk about type scenes today, and I want to make sure that you can follow along on the notes. The notes are going to be on our church website, fbchh.org. If you go to the far right, you'll see the resources tab. You go down, about halfway down, you'll see ABF notes, and we're going to start off today on page 3 of 4 of the ABF notes. Okay, so page 3 is really wrapping up the conversation we were having last week about how the Bible uses stories about women who at least start off barren, who are unable to have children. And we pointed out the fact that stories about barrenness in the Bible are a signal. And we talked about type scenes. And for those of you that can read the screen up here, or were able to read it last week, type scene is a recurring scene. In other words, it happens over and over again, kind of like Groundhog Day, but a little bit less crazy. A recurring scene that signals an impending significant event. So every time you see something happen in the text, you know something else is about to happen. It's like a signal that there is more to come. We talked about romantic comedies, and I'm going to do it one more time because it's super fun. Romantic comedies, within the first 5, I watched one with my wife this week. Within the first 5 minutes, there's an awkward introduction between a girl who's had her heart broken recently and some good-looking guy who at first she doesn't understand and doesn't think is cool, and then she ends up falling in love with him over the course of the movie. And you already know how it's going to turn out because that's the sort of story that we're talking about here. And so the Bible does this from time to time. I'm not saying it happens all the time in Scripture, but there are certainly some things that we can point to where this phenomenon happens. One of them, and the one we talked about the most last week, is whenever there's stories about women who are unable to have children. These stories have been very obviously shaped by their storytellers to make sure we can draw a connection between them all. And they all sort of turn out the same way. Now, if you look on page 3 of the PDF notes, you'll see what I have at the end, some summary statements. In other words, this sort of wraps up kind of what what were we talking about? So by way of summary, let me just kind of review this, and then we'll dive into one last example today before we're done for this morning. So, summary statements. Number 1, whenever a barren woman appears in a story in the Bible, okay, and there's some blanks, and those of you that like to fill in blanks, this is just going to be so much fun for you. I'm so excited for you. Number 1, the casual reader would expect a tragedy, right? We talked about that. A casual reader, when they see a story about a barren woman, are going to be like, aw, that's so sad. This is really hard. Like, they're a wonderful couple. Why can't they have a kid? You know, all the things that we feel whenever we hear stories like that, right? So you would expect a tragedy. However, in an ironic twist, the biblical storytellers use barrenness as a way to tell stories about hope and deliverance. Hope and deliverance. So these are not tragic stories. These are actually stories that when you follow them through all the way to the end, fairly predictably end in some kind of a miraculous birth, and then the birth gives birth to a child who ends up being incredibly significant. Okay, so a couple more subpoints here. In each one of the biblical stories about barrenness, the barrenness is reversed. Okay, there's never a story where a woman is barren at the beginning and then she's still barren at the end of the story. The Bible doesn't tell stories about barrenness like that. And it's often reversed in a miraculous way. In each story, the child that is born plays a significant role in the next era of the story of God's chosen people, right? So it's almost as if God sets up the barrenness in the first place so that then he can tell a story of miracles on the flip side. There's an interesting story from John chapter 9, I think it is, where Jesus comes across a man who has been blind from birth. And his disciples have a really interesting question. It's an easy armchair theologian type question, like a Monday morning quarterback type question. And they say, okay, so Jesus, here's a guy that's been blind since birth. So, did he sin that he was made blind, or did his parents sin so that he was born blind? See, they're assuming, right? They're assuming that some kind of a horrible thing happening to you is the result of somebody's personal sin. And so the disciples want to know, was it him or was it his folks? And Jesus says, whoa, 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 no. Has nothing to do with that. The blindness is not a punishment for anybody's sin. The blindness is an opportunity for the glory of God to be displayed in the life of the person with blindness. And you almost get the sense that God allowed the blindness to happen so that at a point in Jesus' ministry, he could heal him, and then the healing would be a witness and a testimony to the world. Now, I don't know about you, that gives me just a teeny little bit of comfort when I'm going through the middle of my difficult circumstances, because I can, in the back of my head, say, okay, maybe God gave me this affliction, not just because he wants to see me suffer, not just because he wants to see how much pain a human can endure. Maybe he's given me this affliction so that he can heal it at some point, and then God gets the glory for the healing that happened, okay? So it's sort of like that with barrenness. You almost get the sense in the story that God allows the barrenness at the beginning of their lives to almost set up the dramatic rescue and miracle that comes later. Because the child that is born is really important to the next step or the next era of the story. Okay? Another point here. Whenever the impossible situation of barrenness appears in the text, the storyteller is tipping his hand. Like whenever I play cards with Noah, my lovely Noah, who's 4.5 years old, we play various games, right? I'm always telling the kid, would you keep your cards close to your chest? Don't show me what your cards are, because if you show me what your cards are, I know what to play and I win the game in like 3 seconds, right? So kind of keep it hidden. You'll do better in your game. Even Go Fish, like a simple game like that. If you just keep your cards hidden, you have a better chance of winning. Or I could not look at them, but that just defeats all the fun of being a parent anyway. So anyway, we lose so much in life. We got to be able to beat our kids at cards at least. I mean, come on, right? Parents, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, amen. I hear a few amens from my scattered audiences here. Gabe isn't so much, but the other people are. My son is watching on Zoom. Okay, so playing the cards, right? So the storyteller from time to time, it's like in the middle of his story, he shows you his cards so that you know where the story is going before the story actually gets there. And this barrenness thing is a way to tip the cards, to show the cards to your readers so that they know where this is going. So they can know that when they hear a story of barrenness, oh, I know what's going to happen, something amazing and miraculous and hope-filled instead of tragic, which is what you might expect. Okay? So in summary, barrenness in the biblical text is a signal, that's the other blank in that line there, a signal to us readers that we should expect that God is about to show up in this story to bring about a deliverance, no matter how desperate the circumstances are that face the characters in the story. This is really important. The biblical storytellers don't want us to experience the story the way the characters do. Right? Because when you're a character in your own story, do you have any idea what's coming? You're just waiting for the next thing to happen. It's almost like there's this blindness and you can't see all the extra stuff. Like, I know we've talked about Job like tons. And I sort of apologize, but I sort of don't, because it's an amazing story. We, in the readers, in the very first chapter of Job, we get the opportunity to understand the why all this is happening to him. Right? The adversary comes to God and he says, Job only follows you because you give him stuff. If you take away his stuff, he'll curse you to your face. So really, it's God's honor that is on the line. It's his reputation. He's basically being accused by the adversary of buying love from humans. And so God says, no, that's not true. He just loves me because we just have this thing. We have this relationship and he's cool with it. And the adversary is like, I don't think so. I think if you pull away his protection, he's going to curse you to your face. He's going to prove to you that you don't deserve love from humanity. And then God says, okay, fine. I'll remove my protection and I'll let you take away anything of his that you want, but don't touch his life, right? And so Satan goes out and he just devastates all of Job's possessions, and he arranges so that Job's children, all 10 of them, are killed in one day. I mean, that's pretty intense. Now, here's the thing that's different about that. Job has no idea why this is happening. Okay? And then for like 40 chapters, Job complains about why this is happening to him, doesn't he? He's frustrated. He's angry. He's upset. He's confused. He feels betrayed at some points. He feels abandoned by God at other points. He feels like God is attacking him. And as you're reading it, you, the reader, go, Job, no, it's none of that. There's none of those reasons. It's something very specific. And I know you don't know it, but it doesn't mean that it's not happening, right? Because the storyteller doesn't want the reader, that's you and me, to have the same experience that the characters do. The storyteller, in many cases, wants us to know ahead of time how this is going to turn out. So that when it happens, we go, oh, God, I knew you were going to do that. Oh, God, I knew that was coming, right? The storyteller delights in very creatively tipping his playing cards so that you can see them, so that you know where they're going, so that in your own personal crises that you go through, that you're a character in the story and not a reader of the story later, you can trust that God is working in your story the way he worked in the stories of the blind characters in the text. Does that sort of make sense? So that's why he uses things like type scenes. It's the storyteller saying, hey guys, I know you think it's going to be a tragedy, but this is actually going to work out really well, which is why I wrapped up last week by talking about Luke chapter 1, verses 26 through 38. Luke 1, we have the story of Elizabeth, the elderly lady, the cousin of Mary, who has a child much, 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 much later than you would expect. In fact, it's very much a direct echo of the Abraham and Sarah story. Totally connected to those earlier barrenness stories. And Elizabeth, at the end, holds a baby boy in her arms, calls him John, and there's a big celebration, and everybody's happy, and it's a wonderful thing, right? A miracle has happened. The very next thing in the text is that same angel that showed up to Elizabeth comes to visit a teenage unmarried girl in Nazareth by the name of Mary. And he tells her that she's going to experience a childbirth. Now, she has a couple of things going for her. Number one, she's not barren, right? She's still very young. She still has 30 years of childbearing ahead of her. That is at least within the realm of possibility, right? That she could have children. So, I mean, she could have many children. Here's the problem. She has no husband. So that ramps up the impossibility level a little bit further than even if your husband is old, right? Because you don't have anything to work with. And so there is Mary, and she's like, wait, what? I'm going to have a child? Oh, and by the way, this child isn't just an important character in the unfolding of God's story. This child is the central figure of the story that the entire nation has been waiting for literally over 1,000 or 2,000 years. Okay? So this is not just a important character like a Moses or a Samson or a David. We're talking about the central figure, Messiah. And I'm sending this Messiah to an unmarried, unwed virgin named Mary who lives in Nazareth in the middle of stinking nowhere. Okay? But if you've been paying attention to this process, this type scene thing that we've been talking about, then you already are prepared for the possibility. In fact, you might suggest the inevitability that this story is not going to be a tragic story about how God failed to do his promise, even though his promise is absolutely impossible and completely ridiculous. You're prepared already for the fact that God is going to give this miraculous birth, and you know this is going to turn out okay because you've been prepared by all these other scenes to be ready for this. Okay? And I think that's kind of cool. I think that's really important. I think that the text, the storyteller, Luke, I think Luke is a genius. Now, it's really interesting about, can I just do this as a little side note? Luke is a fascinating character in this whole drama because Luke was not one of the original followers of Jesus, right? He's at the best, he's a second generation Christian. Somebody who knew Jesus told Luke about it. Okay? So Luke's not one of the guys who walked and talked with Jesus. He didn't know Jesus personally. He never sat down and had lunch with Jesus. He never went on a walk with Jesus, right? Luke is a Greek doctor. He's not even a Jew. Okay? He's a Greek doctor who comes to Christ at some point, probably under the influence of Paul, and then follows Paul in his ministry. And while he's out with Paul, I think he gets the sense of, you know what, there's a need for another telling of the story of Jesus. But you see, he can't just do what Mark could do or what Matthew could do or even what John could do. He can't just sit back and go, man, oh, I remember the time when, right? Or the Holy Spirit could be like, hey, Matthew, do you remember when Jesus did this? He went to your house and met with all your friends who were tax collectors, and it was so scandalous and everybody got upset. You remember that? And Matthew could write it down. There's none of that. Luke is like, he has a blank slate. He has no memory of anything. So Luke, he tells us in the first few verses of his book, conducts interviews. He tackles it the way a Lee Strobel, if you've seen The Case for Christ, the way a Lee Strobel might tackle this kind of an issue. He goes back and interviews all the people who were there. And we know for a fact that he interviewed Mary, because he gives details in the text that only Mary could have revealed. I suppose the Holy Spirit could have revealed them directly. But if he's doing interviews, Mary is the person that would have told him stuff. Things like, Mary treasured up all these things and pondered them in her heart. Well, how would he know that? Well, I know how. He sat down with Mary and had a conversation with her, and he interviewed her. Why is it that Luke is the only one that tells us any stories about Jesus' birth and his childhood and all that stuff? Now, Matthew tells us about the angels coming, but then it gives like one sentence to, and he was born in Bethlehem. And you're like, thanks, Matthew. That really kind of covers it. We appreciate it. Luke tells us about the shepherds and the angels and the no room for them in the inn. I mean, it's Luke that goes into all these details, right? So Luke's a really fascinating guy. And Luke is the one, a Greek, not even a Jew, who picks up on this barrenness thing in the Old Testament. And he interviews Mary, and he finds out that Mary's cousin is Elizabeth, who is John the Baptist's mother. You're like, you're kidding me. And so he shapes the first couple chapters of his beautiful work about Jesus, continuing on the type scene, saying, God did it again. He did it with Zechariah and Elizabeth, and now he's doing it again. He did it again with Mary. This Jesus, this miracle, it happened, it's real, and Jesus is the one that we've been waiting for. And he's leaning on all that information from the Old Testament to help make the point so much more powerful here in the New Testament. Does that make sense? You guys with me on this type scene thing? All right. You're like, yes, let's move on. Well, I'd like to move on, but we have one more passage that I want to show you, another illustration of this. Because honestly, I think it's fun. It's fun to see how the storyteller tips their cards and shows us where this is going. Yes?
Is it like the foreshadowing you were talking about?
Yes. No, this is an example of foreshadowing. This is a way that they like to foreshadow what's going to happen. Good point. Good point. All right. Now, if you want to turn to page 4, okay? Or if you're just looking at it on the screen, scroll down to page 4 on the notes that are available on our website, fbch.org, the resource tab, ABF notes. Page 4 will kind of give you a blow-by-blow of the one that we're going to talk about here, and this should take us just a few minutes, and then we'll wrap up perhaps even a little bit early, although I'm not promising anything. Okay. So, turn in your Bibles to Genesis chapter 13, please. Genesis 13. Genesis 13. I don't have it up on the screen or anything for you, so you're going to have to do the hard work yourselves. Genesis 13. So, this is really early on in the story, right? The whole story of the entire Bible. And Genesis is fascinating because Genesis carries certain themes through it that are very, very important. And one of those themes is this type scene we're going to talk about here. But in the flow of the story, if you remember, in Genesis chapter 12, a very important character is introduced to the story. And who would that be? Anybody know? You're allowed to cheat. Thank you, Gabe. I heard that in the background. Abraham. Abraham is introduced in Genesis 12. Is Abraham a pretty important character in the unfolding of God's story? Yes. Abraham signals a change in the way God is interacting with the world. From Genesis 1 through 11, he interacts with the world almost as a whole, right? He does the Noah. It represents the entire world. You have the Tower of Babel, which represents all the people that are alive at that time. You have all these stories that relate to the big picture. And then God decides a new strategy is in order, and in chapter 12, he picks one guy, Abraham, and his family that will come from him, the Jews. And he is now going to work the story of salvation through one man and his family instead of kind of doing it for everybody as a giant group all at once. Okay? So Abraham comes onto the scene, and Abraham leaves his father's family and his hometown. And the radical thing about Abraham is he just leaves his family and goes off to launch out on his own. And God says, look, I'm not going to tell you where to go. I am going to tell you where to go. I'm not going to tell you your destination. I'm going to just say, you'll get there. Just leave. Just go. And in the process, I will show you where you need to end up. And he ends up in this land called Canaan, which is right on the Mediterranean Sea. We know of today as Israel. And he starts to live there. Now remember, he doesn't own anything there. He's not an owner of anything. So he just lives in tents. He goes up here for a while and he moves around. There's a famine. He makes a horrible decision to go down to Egypt. God didn't want him to go there, and he went anyway, and he lied about his wife and claimed she was his sister, and he got rich off of her, and then he gets rebuked by a pagan, which is always fun if you've ever worked in a secular job. I've had that happen to me before. Rebuked about my conduct and my attitude by somebody who doesn't know God. And then he comes back to Canaan, and we find out that he had taken family members with him from Ur of the Chaldees, where he started to live, and had kind of taken them with him to help him get started in the new land. And one of them is his nephew, a guy by the name of Lot. Now, many of us have heard these stories so much that you already know that things don't turn out so well for our buddy Lot, okay? But I want you to realize that the text sets him up as somebody who could potentially be very privileged. His uncle is really wealthy. Because of that, he's learning the family business. He also becomes wealthy as a result. And we come to chapter 13, verse 1, and this is what the text says. So Abram went up from Egypt, and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him, into the Negev, or the south country. That's what that means in Hebrew. The south country, the southern part of Israel. Now, Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. And he journeyed on from the south country as far as Bethel to the place where his tent had been at the beginning. That's much further north in Israel. Between Bethel and Ai, to the place where he had made an altar at the first. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord. This is typical language for everything's going great between Abram and God. They're having a relationship. He's moving around as God leads him. He's doing good. He's building an altar. He's worshiping God. He's sort of back on track. The whole Egypt thing was a disaster. Let's not talk about that anymore. And let's just go back to the way things were before. Worshiping God, moving around in the promised land. Okay. Verse 5 is when the problem begins, if you can call it that. And Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. And you would expect that, right? He's a grown man. He has his own investments. His uncle probably gave him some to start off, just like most parents give to their kids. And maybe he has some of his father's stuff that he took with him into exile with Abraham. Okay, so he's got his own stuff. Verse 6, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together. For their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together, and there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Everybody who's ever gone into business with their family understands the problem here, right? There's tension. Who gets the best stuff? And especially when you think about just the practical issues of who gets the best water sources, because water sources are not plentiful in the Middle East at this time period. And big flocks need lots of water. They need lots of grass, which is also not super plentiful at this time. And so basically, just logically, realistically, you look at the situation and you go, we can't both fit into this space. We need to separate. We need to split. You need to go one way. I need to go the other. Now, Abram does it in a super cool way. And in fact, whenever we need to separate company from people who we've worked with, who we love, who are family, if we would all have the wisdom and the graciousness of Abram, I think these things would be a lot less messy and ugly and just be fine and just be normal, and we would just deal with it. Take a look at verse 8. Then Abram said to Lot, "Let there be no strife between you and me. We're just fighting about this. Why do we fight? We're family. Let's not fight. Between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we're kinsmen. We're brothers. We're family. We are family." I know you guys are all thinking that. Sorry, live stream. Those of you on Zoom really got a treat there. Just really got a treat. And I heard you giggle, Joe. I heard that. Hey, anytime you can make your own kid giggle, you're doing fine, I think. All right, verse 8. For we are kinsmen. And then he says in verse 9, "Is not the whole land before you? Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I'll go to the right. Or if you take the right hand, then I'll go to the left." Abram gives Lot first dibs. Hey, this whole land is free. There's no rule that says you have to go one way, I have to go the other way. Just you pick a way. You go a direction. Take your flocks and your herds with my blessing, and I'll go this way, hopefully with your blessing, and we can still be friends. We can still be family. It's all good. We don't have to fight over the same resources. We can split up, and you do your thing, and I'll do my thing. Verse 10, this is where it gets interesting. "And Lot lifted up his eyes and saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere." Now, why is that important? Anybody know? Livestock to drink, right? If it's well watered, it's not just that it's prettier, although I'm sure it's prettier. It's not just that it's prettier, it's that it's much more suitable for your livestock to be able to survive and thrive, right? And have babies and produce more livestock, which makes you rich, right? Well watered everywhere. And then notice this little phrase. Like what? Like the garden of the Lord. Now, what's he talking about? Garden of the Lord. What's that? If you've been reading just the very few chapters that have already gone by, we've taught God planted a garden, right? And in that garden, where did he place the first, he placed the first man and the first woman in the garden to work the land, right? And that's the scene where all the bad stuff happened. And then when all the bad stuff happened to Adam and Eve, right? What happened to the garden? They got booted out. They got evicted. Or as the guy on Curious George says, evicted. They got kicked right out. They got sent on their way, all right? They got sent on their way out the door, and they get moved out into the wilderness outside of the garden. Now, I don't know much about gardening. If Christine Rowling were in here, I'm sure she could tell me a lot more. My wife could tell me a lot more. She knows a lot more than I do. But it's a lot easier to produce crops in a garden than it is just out in the wilderness, right? Our family discovered, we explored yesterday for the very first time, we have about an acre of property on the other side of Route 14 down by Catherine Creek. And we've not been brave enough to go down there until quarantine has driven us from our home because we're so stinking bored. And so we all went exploring down in the wilderness out there. And we found an old abandoned snowmobile. Pretty cool. We found the remnants of a destroyed basketball hoop, just thrown out in the middle of literally nowhere, along with some other treats and tires and things that are super awesome. But there's this one spot that is very flat, and it's just sort of grassy. But you know what, though? Like, if we just threw some seed down on that land and then went back to the house and came and checked on it in a few months, we might see some results, right? There might be some seeds that popped through and became plants. But it's different, right? If you go to your garden that has all of the ground churned up, that's in a good spot to get lots of sun and lots of rain and all that, that you have a lot more success, right? So when Adam and Eve are kicked out of the garden, they're pushed out into the wilderness, and the idea is everything that could have come easy to them is now going to come hard. That's what the curse is all about. You still have to do what humans do, but now it's hard. It's hard work. Sweat of your brow, blood, sweat, tears. That's how you get stuff done in the world outside. Lot looks out across this land, and he sees one valley that reminds him of what he imagines when he hears the stories about the Garden of Eden. So where do you think he's going to pick? He's going to pick that, right? It's like the Garden of Eden. It's perfect. It's ready for us. Listen what the text says. In the direction of Zoar. There's a little parentheses statement there at the end of verse 10. Let's pretend it's not there. Let's skip over that and come to verse 11. Verse 11. So Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley. And all God's people said, duh, right? Like, of course he did. It's the well-watered place. It's the place that looks exactly like the Garden of Eden. If you had to choose between that and the rocky stubble of the wilderness on the right hand, which one are you going to pick? Every day of the week, you pick the Jordan Valley. That's what you do. To this day, I've been there. The Jordan Valley is a lush agricultural just wonder. It's gorgeous. I mean, you look from some of the mountains surrounding the valley, it is just wow. If you're an agriculture farming person, you would want a piece of that land. And Lot wanted the whole thing for himself. So, Lot journeyed east. Verse 11, thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. So, just freezing right there for a second. First question on your notes is this. Would a casual reader of this story, casual reader, right? Like somebody who's not really paying that much attention. Would a casual reader of the text think that Lot made the right choice or the wrong choice? The correct choice, right? Why would they say that he made the right choice? It makes sense for his survival, right? Specifically how? How does it make sense? How does it make sense? Why is it good for him to go to the Jordan Valley? It's just the stuff we already talked about. The resources are there, right? He's got water. He's got vegetation, right? That's got to be apparent. How do you know it's well watered if there's no vegetation? So there's water, there's vegetation, and then it also mentions there's cities there. So what happens if Lot runs short on supplies? There's a city. I can go find a blacksmith to help me make some more tools, or I can sell some of my sheep to people in the city if I am short on cash, or whatever. He's got resources in the Jordan Valley. You look at that and you go, wow, that just makes sense. Lot, you know what? You're a kid and all, but you made a pretty smart choice. Did Lot make the right decision? A casual reader would say yes. But here's the second question. Does the writer of Genesis agree with the casual reader in this case? Does the storyteller think that Lot made the right decision by going towards the Jordan Valley? I told you that we had to skip over something, right? One of those sneaky pastor things that I do from time to time to try to, hide something so then I can reveal it later and seem like I'm Houdini or something. Go back to verse 10, right? So it says, Lot lifted up his eyes, saw that the Jordan River, or the Jordan Valley, was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. That's really interesting too. We'll get to that some other time. Like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zoar. And then you see the parentheses. Now, not all translations probably have the parentheses, but the more modern ones insert the parentheses so that you sort of understand that this is like a note that the storyteller is kind of throwing in there to help explain what he just said. And what does it say inside that parentheses? This was before what happened? Well, Sodom and Gomorrah, but what happened to it? What does the text say happened to Sodom and Gomorrah? This was before the Lord destroyed the two main cities in this region. Now, what is the storyteller doing with that little sentence? Like, why would he put that in there? Any ideas? Any thoughts? What does yours say, Melissa?
At the south end of the Dead Sea.
At the end of verse 10?
Yeah.
This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah? We may need to look at that translation you got there, Mrs. Ames. Why would this storyteller put that in? I'm not trying to trick you. I know you're all worried that I'm trying to trick you. A warning, right? Is Lot going to the safest neighborhood he could possibly go to? Apparently not, because sometime in the future, is it going to just like be destroyed in a battle with another nation? Is it? What does the text say? How do these two cities meet their end? The Lord destroys them, right? It's not even that they get into a fight with another country and then they end up, falling apart because of that. The Lord himself personally is going to destroy these two cities. So the storyteller wants us, the reader, to be more clued in than Lot was. The storyteller wants us to know this is a really bad idea. This is actually the opposite of a good idea. This is a good idea turned inside out, like you find out all your socks in the laundry when you get them out. They're always turned inside out. This is that. It's a great idea. If you turn it inside out and upside down, then it's actually a bad idea, right? This is the worst thing that could possibly happen. And I also say, take a look down at verse 13. Verse 13 is another hint from the storyteller that Lot's decision was actually pretty horrible. Verse 13. Now, the men of Sodom were what? Wicked, great sinners against the Lord. Now, let's be fair to Lot. Maybe Lot didn't know that up front when he chose that place, right? But I imagine Lot was raised in Abraham's family. So Lot is raised with a knowledge of Yahweh. He's raised with and maybe it's only a small amount of knowledge, because remember, not a lot has happened yet. But he knows that there's a creator God. He's different from all the gods around. He doesn't believe in wanton violence and crime. And all. Like, the God of the Bible, from Genesis 1 through 11, Genesis 1 through 12, is a God that can be known. He's a God that you can find out things about him. And Abraham passes that along to Lot. How long do you suppose it took Lot to figure out that the men in the cities near where he's settling are wicked? Do you think it took long? If he's doing business with them, which he's probably doing business at a minimum, right? He's going to discover right away that they do business a certain way, right? He's going to discover when he walks into Sodom, a temple here, a temple there, a worshiper there. He's going to hear and see the evidence of violence in the streets, which is one of the things that God destroys Sodom for later. You see evidence of this. And what you see in Lot, as you continue on in the story, is that Lot starts off in the valley outside the cities, and then he moves his tents closer to the cities, and eventually, by the time the cities are destroyed, he is living in the city as a respected leader of the city. Or at least semi-respected. So Lot may not have known up front what the storyteller tells us, but he probably figured it out soon enough, and he didn't run for the hills. He made himself more comfortable. Okay? So the text is making it pretty clear that whatever Lot gets out of all this, he has it coming, because he either ignored warnings, or once he got there and figured out what it was, he didn't backtrack and say, no, I'm moving away somewhere else. Because there was plenty of room for him to move somewhere else if he wanted to go. But here's something I want to suggest to you. There was a detail that I read for you already that should have been another signal to the rest of us who have been paying attention that this is a bad idea. And it's a detail that at first does not look very interesting until you notice how that same detail pops up in several other stories just in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. And that detail is right here in verse 11. It says, so Lot chose for himself all the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed what? What does it say? East. East. All right. So, verse 11. So we have verse 13 that says, or no. So there's three. Is there any evidence in the text that this is a bad idea? The first piece of evidence is from verse 10, which says, the Lord destroyed Sodom. Thank you. That's a slight upgrade. I appreciate that. Good, good, good. There you go. So the Lord destroyed Sodom. That's your first hint that something is about to go wrong. Verse 13, we find out that the men of Sodom are what? Unusually wicked. That's a really good way of putting it. Woohoo! Unusually wicked against the Lord. And then I'm suggesting to you that the third detail that should tell you that this is a bad idea is actually a strange one from verse 11, which says that he journeyed east. Now, for those of you that live on the east side of Elmira, for those of you that live in the east part of Horseheads, I'm not saying that every time somebody moves east, we moved east back in 2003 years ago. So we moved east. I don't think that that meant that somehow we have made a bad decision and we're going against the will of the Lord, okay? I don't think that. However, for readers of Genesis, they should know that journeying east is generally a sign that something bad is about to happen. Let me explain before you label me as making something up out of nothing. I got a list here of passages. You see the list of passages in the middle? Look up the following verses. Genesis chapter 3, verse 24. 3:24. Genesis 3, verse 24. Dan Rowling, would you mind reading that for me as soon as you get there? And those of you at home that may not be able to hear his voice, read along in your own heads, Genesis 3:24. Go.
He drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life.
Okay, so this is the first example in the book of Genesis of the word east showing up. So you have, again, this is going to show you my artistic ability. So if you want to be jealous, now's the time. Here's the Garden of Eden. Wow. Thank you. I appreciate the appreciation. This is the Garden of Eden. Where does God put the angel with the flaming sword? All right? This is where the angel is. With a flaming sword. Which I just, I assume that's bad. Like, I assume that if you met that angel, you would probably lose control of your bowel functions and you would just run away as fast as you possibly could. Okay? So, that angel is placed at the east. Why do you suppose the angel is placed at the east? To guard the way to the tree of life. But even more fundamentally, it's because I think when Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden, did they go north? No. If they went north, you might have put the angel at the north, right? If they went south, would you put the angel south? Probably. If they went west, you'd put the angel in the west. The reason they put the angel on the east is because Adam and Eve were kicked out this way. It doesn't say that. I'm sort of guessing, I guess, just based on logic. Like, where would you put the guard? You put the guard where you would suspect someone might want to break in. And so this happens. Now, when the flood happens, right? The flood, in my opinion, washes away all the evidence of where the Garden of Eden ever was. So I don't think it's really worthwhile for us to do a whole ton of searching. Because if God is willing to send a worldwide cataclysm to erase something, it's probably going to stay erased, right? Like, we're probably not going to find Noah's Ark up in a mountain somewhere. It's probably not going to happen. But could it happen? Sure. If you want to devote your life to that, knock yourself out. But I'm not sure. I don't know.
Or go to Tennessee.
Yeah, just go to Tennessee and pretend. Pretend that you're there, because it's close enough. Actually, it's Kentucky, lady. Kentucky. Okay, but let's get back to my point. Are Adam and Eve being sent east as a reward for their good behavior? Not really, right? They're being sent east as a punishment for their bad behavior. The garden represents, we already talked about this, the garden is where it's easy. The garden is where it's all prepared for you. The garden is where you just have to pluck the fruit from the branches to harvest. East is the wilderness. And in the wilderness, you have to dig up the ground yourself. You have to plant the seed yourself. You have to fight the weeds yourself. You have to harvest by the sweat of your brow and eat bread, sweat of your brow, all the days of your life. That's the east. The east is like the place you don't want to go, right? So what is Lot doing? He's moving to a place that looks to him like the Garden of Eden, but in order to do it, he's headed east, which should at least kind of make you nervous. Well, Adam and Eve had to go east. That's where the wilderness is. Why would you want to go east? Now, If that were the only time it popped up, I would say coincidence, just ignore it. It doesn't really have that much significance. However, it's not the only time. Take a look at the very next chapter, Genesis 4. Genesis 4, this is the story, you may remember. Siblings everywhere love this story. It's the story of Cain and Abel, all right? Usually older siblings like it more than younger siblings because the younger sibling's the one that gets whacked in this story. But basically Cain, right, decides that he's mad because his brother has been accepted. This is truly, the Cain and Abel story is one of the great stories in Scripture. And I've probably thought more about the Cain and Abel story than I should, just because there's probably other stuff to think about as well. But it's so fascinating. It deals with so many different issues. Cain, right, feels like God has cheated him. So he kills his brother who was accepted so that then he can at least have revenge for the fact that he took God's attention. He took God's blessing from me. And God comes to Cain very personally offended by that and saying, Cain, if you had done the right thing, I would have accepted you too. Why do you think you have to hurt your brother because I gave him something that was good? He did what was right. Of course he gets the reward. If you had done what was right, you would have gotten one too. And then God holds him accountable for his crimes, and he says, you remember that famous expression, am I my brother's keeper, right? And the answer in the text is very clearly, yes. Yes, you are actually. You're responsible to take care of your brother, not kill him. And then God says, that's it, buddy. I'm going to make you a wanderer throughout the earth. You're never going to be able to raise, have crops that are fruitful again. Like, you're done. You're done. You were a farmer and a very successful farmer. You're done now. You're going to have to go do something else. You're going to be a wandering vagabond. You're going to be a hobo, a homeless person, wandering throughout the earth for the rest of your life. And then we come to verse 14 of chapter 4. Or verse 15. Then the Lord said to Cain, not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold. And the Lord put a mark on Cain, lest any who were found him should attack him. So is that a sign of grace at the end of this story? Absolutely. Cain deserved death for killing his brother. And he's like, look, they're all going to kill me if they find me. And he's like, well, no, actually that's not going to happen. I'm going to put some kind of a mark on you so that when people see it, they know, oh, off limits. Can't kill that guy. God's blessing or God's protection is on him, right? So then we come to verse 16. Then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord, and he settled in the land of Nod. And what direction did he go? East of Eden. So mom and dad were in the garden, and they moved east. Cain has made a mess of that land. And so Cain decides he's going to leave further east. And we also have this interesting little detail that says Cain went out from the presence of the Lord. So Cain is escaping. He's not just traveling somewhere. He's escaping the presence of God, or so he thinks, by moving east. And instead of wandering as a homeless tent liver the rest of his life, bouncing around as a nomad from place to place, he settles and builds himself a city, which becomes the foundation of the civilization that is so wicked it gets destroyed in the flood. It's the reason for the flood, is Cain and his horrible descendants that create this civilization that's so wicked and evil that it just drives God to wipe out almost the entire planet. So we have two occasions of going east, and both of them are sketchy, right? Adam and Eve leave and go east because of judgment. Cain goes east to escape the presence of the Lord, to establish a civilization that is wicked and evil. And now Lot is going east. Oh, and by the way, the people who live out there are wicked against the Lord. Oh, and by the way, the people out there later on are going to be destroyed by the Lord. The storyteller wants you and I to know this is a horrible, horrible, horrible idea. Not necessarily that he did it wrong initially, but the fact that he stayed there is a problem. Now, just in case you think maybe it's only 2 times, it's a coincidence, blah, 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 blah. Genesis 11. So just 3 chapters later, right? Genesis 11, we have this crazy story called the Tower of Babel. And let me read it. Verse 1 says this, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And all God's people said, wouldn't that be nice? Holy cow. And as people migrated from from the east, thank you. They found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. Bless you. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Verse 5, and the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore its name was called Babel or Babel, because there the Lord confused or Babelized the languages of all the earth. And from there the Lord dispersed them over the face of all the earth. So, after Noah, humanity starts to reproduce and repopulate the earth. Now, God intended for family units, once they would be established, to split off and go start spreading out and explore and like settle different parts of the earth. Because I think he understood that with the sin nature, when you put a lot of humans together, a lot of great stuff can happen, and then also a lot of bad stuff can happen, right? Mob mentality, I don't know if you've heard that expression. Herd mentality. This is a real thing. And if the people that are in charge are good, then a mob mentality can be great, because we're all going to be led towards good, godly things. When the people in charge are not so great, then that means we're all going to put all of our resources and our ingenuity and our intelligence towards evil purposes. And oh, by the way, that's really, really bad, right? So they decide, you know what? We're not going to spread out. We're going to consolidate our power. We're going to build a city. We're going to build a tower all the way up to heaven. We're going to make a name for ourselves so that way we're not scattered throughout the earth. They're basically saying, God, your plan for repopulating the earth, we're not going to do that. We have a better plan. And the plan is called We Humans Run the Show. And it's called We're going to build a name for ourselves. And it's called We Don't Need You, really. And this is the first time you discover after the flood that humanity still has a problem, right? Because if you're just naive and you read the flood story, you go like, oh, God killed all the bad people. And he kept all the good ones. And then you're like, oh, no, wait a minute. Noah's that drunk who got drunk afterwards and got, in his tent and his son and all that story. Oh, yeah, his kids, yeah, they had problems too. Yeah, humanity's headed right back the way they were before the flood. And so God's like, whoa, we're not letting this happen again. So he jumps down with the language and all that stuff. And this moving eastward is just a part of the story. It's just a little detail. But again, it's a city going east. God comes down and looks at it and goes, no, not good, not crazy about this, and God judges by dispersing everybody. Now, luckily there's no body count here. It's just splitting them up with languages and stuff. That may have led to some conflicts, but later on conflicts for sure. But do you see? It's like a negative thing. All three occasions so far. Adam and Eve going east, bad. Cain moving east and setting up a civilization that leads to the destruction of the world, bad. The people who are the survivors of the flood heading east to establish a city, to build themselves a name, also bad. Okay? So here's Lot. He has a choice. You would think that by now, him having heard these stories, that he kind of says, let's let east be somebody else's thing, and I'm going to go a different direction. Okay? But at the very least, the storyteller, even if poor Lot didn't have a clue, even if Lot didn't know what he was doing initially, he should have figured out moving east and settling near a city may not be the greatest move when God has said he wants you to wander throughout the promised land, like Abraham did, going place to place. Okay? Now, just really quick, chapter 16, verse 12. I'm not going to develop this one too much, but chapter 16, verse 12. This is where Abram has Sarai, his slave, right, has a child with him called Ishmael. And then Ishmael can't stay because Ishmael is going to complicate the fact that Isaac, the son of Sarah, is going to be the one through whom he's going to be the new chieftain. And basically, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to have one of his rivals living right there in the house with him. So they send Ishmael away. And where do they send Ishmael? Guess what? They send Ishmael east. Now, that doesn't mean they're sending him to wickedness. It just means that the person who's not chosen gets to go east. East is the way you don't want to go. And then again, in chapter 25, verses 5 and 6, chapter 25, 5 and 6, Abraham, this is at the death of Abram, okay? So Abraham, verse 5, Abraham gave all he had to Isaac. That's the way God wanted it to be. Verse 6, but to the sons of his concubines. Apparently, Abraham had more than one. Apparently, he didn't learn from his lesson with the Hagar thing. But to the sons of his concubines, Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac, where? Eastward to the east country. That's where you send the people that are not the chosen, blessed people. You send them east. So, all I'm saying is not that this is some deep spiritual thing. All I'm saying is that the storyteller, as he's telling his story, not only does he give us this obvious hint that this is a bad idea, right? The Lord destroyed Sodom. You should be like, yeah, I don't want to move near the place that's going to be a crater in like a few years, right? Not only does he also give this obvious one in verse 13, that the men of Sodom were unusually wicked before the Lord, against the Lord, right? Which explains why he destroys them from verse 10, right? So he gives two very obvious ways for us to know that Lot is making a horrible, horrible mistake. But then also, I believe this detail that he's moving to the east is just another way for the writer of Genesis to point out he's moving away from the presence of the Lord, away from the blessing, away from all of the good things, and he's moving towards the wicked, and he's moving towards judgment. And it's just meant to be a sort of like another clue, right? We're talking about clues, signals. It's another signal in the text that this decision Lot made is going to be colossally bad. And so that's how this type scene thing works. So the first example last week, barrenness. That one's kind of cool because it has more of a spiritual significance. At least I have a lesson I can walk away from with that. This one, there's not so much a lesson you walk away from with it. It just sort of is, again, another example of the storyteller cluing us in as the reader. So even if Lot doesn't know that this was a bad idea, we should know this was a bad idea. Okay? Biblical text is an accurate representation of what happened. Okay? The fact that it's written as a story with some of these literary devices does not mean that it was made up. It just means that God arranged the details of history to have some of these echoes of each other so that the readers of the stories later could piece it all together and realize that this story that is unfolding is not a series of disconnected scenes, right? It is one narrative woven together. And the different pieces connect to one another, which is, again, why it's important, and sometimes I beat this drum more than I should. It's why it's important that you read throughout the scriptures. You don't just settle down into Paul because Paul has nice, neat, logical arguments that I can really enjoy. Please enjoy them. Please learn from them. And if you want to say it's my favorite, have at it. We're allowed to have parts of it that resonate with us more than others. That's cool. But if you ignore the first, especially those of us that ignore the Old Testament completely, because it's got some messy stuff in it. If you do that, you are absolutely cutting the legs out from anything the New Testament can provide for you. So, this is why, for example, and this is a little bit of a side note, this is why I believe it is important to fight for the inspiration and the believability and the accuracy of the Old Testament events as much as the New Testament events. Here's what I hear from some pastors now that are trying to walk this fine line, right? They believe that there is a lot of historical evidence that is very plausible that Jesus actually rose from the dead, and that the stories of the resurrection in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right, are accurate, that they actually happened the way that was written. And all of us go, yeah! Well, there's one very prominent pastor who I like very much in some regards, who says, no, I'm anchoring my soul to the accuracy of the resurrection, because without that, Christianity falls apart. I just want to make a suggestion to the same pastor who has some doubts about whether or not the Jonah and the fish story happened and whether this happened in the Old Testament. He's like, I don't know about that. I don't worry about that. But this, I'm convinced of. If you decide to take away your confidence that the first 67.5% of the Bible might have some inaccuracies in it. It's generally true, but we shouldn't worry about the details. We shouldn't get hung up on whether or not these things actually happen. They're more stories that tell us about who we are. So then we get to the New Testament, and that's where we want you to believe that it really happened. I'm telling you, first of all, logically, it doesn't make any sense. And secondly, the New Testament is built on the legs of the Old Testament. If you chop down the legs of the Old Testament and say, it's too unbelievable, there's crazy stuff that happens in that book, all these myths and legends. If you say that, then you're undermining the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of the apostles, and all the stuff we want you to believe loses its potency and its trustworthiness and its ability. Friends, I know this is not popular today, but it's all connected. And if one piece is valid, the rest of it needs to be valid. And if one piece is a lie, then the rest of it is contaminated by that lie. You can't escape the complexity of the Old Testament by just saying, I want to hang out in the New Testament where less crazy stuff happens. As if a guy raising from the dead is less crazy than a guy surviving 3 days in the belly of a fish. Right? Coming back from the dead, that's certainly not crazy. Anyway, that's my soapbox for today. Love you. See you in church in like 15 minutes. Bye-bye. Thank you, Zoom people. Talk to you later. I'll have new notes next week.